I want to welcome all of you to our panel on the history of Boston's housing inequality and unaffordability. My name is Professor Lisa Alexander. I'm one of the new professors here at Boston College Law School, but I've been a law professor for 16 years, and I specialize in housing law and policy, particularly in urban communities. I teach courses here at Boston College Law School in housing law and policy, and a few of my students are here, thank you. I also teach corporations, and I teach local government law. I am also the faculty director of housing and property rights programs in the new initiative in land, housing, and property rights here at Boston College Law School. And I guess my other title is that I'm married to Professor Mitchell, who is the organizer of this event, and I have sort of seen the ideas that he's put into place over the last 20 years since we've been married culminate in this amazing event that we're having here today. We're going to have this panel connect really to the last panel in that we're talking about housing issues and we're talking about urban issues, particularly here in Boston. So I want to first introduce our esteemed panelists. We have here today Annie Calef, who is research manager at the Boston Indicators Project. She recently completed her master's degree in city planning at MIT. During her time at MIT, she interned with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, assisting the data services team with data and spatial analysis to promote smart and equitable growth. Her own graduate works focused on issues like school segregation, community economic development, and she has a master's degree as well in educational studies from Johns Hopkins University and is a graduate of Pomona College, and we're happy to have her on our panel today. Our second panelist will be Professor Karilyn Crockett, who is an assistant professor at MIT as well, and she's in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning and is the author of an amazing book that she will talk about today called People Before Highways. Professor Crockett earned her PhD from the American Studies program at Yale. She has a Master in Science and Geography from the London School of Economics and a Master of Arts and Religion from Yale Divinity School. Her research has focused on large land use changes in the 20th century in American cities and examines the social and geographic implications of structural poverty. Prior to being at MIT, she served as the Director of Economic Policy and Research and Director of Small Business Development for the City of Boston, and most recently she served as the City of Boston's first Chief of Equity. We also have David Price, who is the Associate Director of BC Law's Initiative on Land, Housing, and Property Rights, and who really has been doing so much heavy lifting to help bring this whole conference together. So we're so thankful to him for that, but also for being one of our panelists today. David Price prior to joining BC Law, he worked for 27 years helping build strong local development organizations in Boston, and for 13 years was the executive director of Nuestra Comunidad Development Corporation in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood. Prior to that, he served as deputy director, general counsel for Madison Park Corporation, executive director for the 10th City Corporation, and has been involved in organizing Mel King's campaigns for mayor way back in 79 and 83. He's a graduate of Harvard College and also a graduate of Boston College Law School. And our final presenter is Maria Latimore, who leads Homes for Equity, a project to build intergenerational wealth through homeownership for people of color in Roxbury who have experienced housing discrimination. And she's a child growing up in Roxbury. She has 30 years of experience planning successful projects and programs, and she has a BA in business management from Simmons College. So that's our esteemed panelists, and I just wanted to start off this panel by saying a little bit about the problems that we're going to talk about in further detail, the panelists are going to talk about in further detail on this panel. So what is true, right, and it connects to the other panels, is that we have a history of racist housing policies in the United States, particularly a history of urban racist housing policies in the United States. And it's relevant to this issue of why we have so many housing affordability challenges in Boston in particular and in Massachusetts generally, right? And that history is sort of up on the slide, and I won't go through it extensively, but the idea is ever since we had a federal housing policy in the United States, we have had racist housing policies that have allocated housing opportunities to people both based upon race and structured opportunity in communities based upon race, starting with the 1933 Homeowners Loan Corporation, who built those maps that are redlining maps, to the Federal Housing Administration, to the Fannie Mae, Freddie Macs using those same maps, and then further the GI Bill, which didn't benefit people of color, and then we also had the Highway Act, which we're going to be talking about. So these are just examples of this history of redlining, and this is a picture of both Newton, well, where we are now, as well as Roxbury, right? And what you can see from these old maps is that the area that we're in, and I'm going to see if my pointer will work, this is Brookline, and this area here is Boston College, where we are, and we're at the law school, which is a little further up, but this is the area we're in. As you can see, most of that is green, and some of it is blue. Sadly, some of it is blue because at the time, this system of racial allocating opportunities also extended to Jewish individuals who were also were discriminated against, and the green areas are green because there's a presence of Jewish individuals living in them at the time, right? If we move over to Roxbury, this is all red, as well as the South End. And the reason it's all red is because at the time, only about 5% of black people actually lived in Roxbury at the time, but yet their presence meant that the entire area was zoned as red or red line, which meant that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the FHA, and other federal organizations would not certify mortgages that were coming from those areas or would not provide mortgages to people in those areas. South End, only 25% of the people were black, but yet there it is. So our panelists today are going to talk about this history in more detail than I can about especially how it manifests itself in Boston and Roxbury. And so without further ado, Anne is going to talk about some of the dynamics in Boston today and how that has influenced us.
I have to say that I really like your earrings, and I'm excited for our panel because I feel like we all have exciting earrings today. But thank you for that introduction. I am very happy to be here today and share with you all some more regional context. My co-panelists will be sharing more neighborhood and community level data. And the goal for me in my presentation is really to just talk more about the relationship between Boston and its suburban areas, Boston as a part of a broader region. The story that I would like to tell is one of persistent residential segregation by race and class, of ongoing exclusionary practices, and eroding affordability, both region-wide and in our cities in particular. And so I will share a couple of neighborhood-level slides at the end, but I'm going to just jump in right now to some regional data. The first slide that I'm going to show you is a map of Greater Boston that shows the share of residents that are Black by city and town across Greater Boston. As you can see, the cities and towns that have the largest share of Black residents are concentrated north and south of Boston. Brockton, Randolph, and Boston, just 3 cities out of, I think, about 148 or so on this map, contain 50% of the region's Black population. You'll also observe, it's kind of hard to turn your head here. You'll also notice that there's a large part of the region where less than 5% of a town's residents identify as Black, right? So that's a very small percentage, but a large share of our regional area. A lot of these towns that have such a small share of Black residents are also our highest income towns. And you'll see that on the next slide that compares median household income to the share of residents that are Black or Latino. And so just to orient us a bit here, the y-axis looks at median household income. The census does top code our income at $250,000, so Dover could have a median household income higher than $250,000, but we don't know. If you've been through Dover, it probably does. On the x-axis here, we have the share of residents that identify as Black or Latino, and our circle size is the total town population, so that's why Boston stands out so much. So you'll notice that our highest income towns have some of the lowest shares of Black and Latino residents, while some of our cities and towns with the highest share of Black and Latino residents have the lowest median household incomes. One thing that we all think at Boston Indicators is very notable about this chart as well is all of the white space in the upper right-hand corner. And what that tells us is that there aren't any cities or towns out of 148 or so on here that have a moderate share of Black and Latino residents and a moderate household income. Now, in addition to all of the historical practices that Professor Alexander outlined so well earlier, one ongoing factor that contributes to this persistent residential segregation by race and class that we see here is exclusionary zoning. And by that I mean when we zone in such a way that it's difficult to build anything other than a single-family home, which is often then cost prohibitive to many families, and particularly Black and Latino families. And you'll see that in this next slide, which looks at parcels where it's difficult, again, to build anything other than a single family home. And so these are parcels, or rather properties. I'm going to try and pivot a little bit this way. These are areas where really the homes are just very expensive, right, or just more expensive. And I included the commuter rail lines here because that is a shared regional asset, right? It's a public good. But you'll notice that a lot of the stops on the commuter rail line are in areas where it is hard to build multifamily housing, for example, or a more affordable starter home or condo. And instead, you see properties like the one in the image here, which is a large, more expensive home. Now, all of these factors, right, and ongoing discriminatory barriers that make it difficult for Black families in particular to accumulate wealth means that in Greater Boston, we actually have one of the highest racial homeownership gaps in the country. And you'll see that on this next slide, which compares the share of households that own their home by race and ethnicity in our region. So I think I have these numbers memorized. But you'll notice that white households, approximately 2/3 of white households own their homes compared to just about 1/3 of Black households and Latino households. Unfortunately, this does hold true when we compare within income buckets, when we try to hold income a little more constant. As you can see here, where we've distributed those households into buckets based on the share of the area median income that they earn. So if we focus just on those homes earning between 50% and 80% of the AMI, we see a similar racial home ownership gap. About 2/3 of white households own their home compared to about 1/4 of Black households in Greater Boston. Unfortunately, we find that with rising interest rates and rising home prices in the region, that the just general affordability is eroding. And this has the potential, among other things, to continue to kind of expand our racial homeownership gap and our racial wealth gap. So the next slide I'll show you is, I think, perhaps the wonkiest of all of them, so bear with me. But we're going to look at the annual income that is needed to purchase a low-priced home in Greater Boston. And by that I mean, what income would you need to earn to comfortably afford your monthly mortgage payments? So at the top here, just to start filling this chart in 2020, you needed to earn about $82,000 per year to comfortably afford that monthly mortgage payment. It increased in 2021. And then by last fall, you really needed to earn an income of above $138,000 per year if you didn't want to spend more than 30% of your monthly income on your mortgage payments, right? Not be housing cost burdened. And so to fill in this chart, we're going to add the number of renters that met these income thresholds by race and ethnicity. And again, it's a lot here, but I'm going to focus our attention really just on the row that looks at Black renters, okay? And so you can see that in 2020, about 17,000 Black renter households had an income that exceeded that 82,000 threshold, so they could comfortably afford that mortgage payment, again, for a lower cost home in the region. But by 2022, last fall, that value had fallen to 5,000, right? So I think first off, this is just a dismally low number. Okay. Second, while affordability, or rather rising interest rates and rising home costs has eroded affordability for all families, we see that the decrease over the past 2 years in the number of renter households that could afford these payments is greatest for Black families. And that's where we see the potential to grow the racial wealth gap, or the racial home ownership gap. And so, turning to city and neighborhood level trends, I'm actually going to show a slide with Greater Boston trends, and then I'm going to go to city and neighborhood level trends. But continuing this thread of unaffordability, this first slide will show the share of households that are share of renter households that are housing cost burdened, meaning they pay more than 30% of their income on rent. You can see that overall in Greater Boston, about 45% of all renters are housing cost burdened. This share is even greater for Black and Latino renters, where about half of renters are housing cost burden. And I'd draw your attention to that burnt orange colored bar, which are those that are severely cost burdened, which means that they are paying more than 50% of their monthly income on their rent, okay? And there we see that about a quarter of Black and Latino renter households are severely cost burdened. And this has pretty real implications for who can stay, right, in the city, right, stay in the region. And so this next slide looks at how we've started to see some neighborhood change within the city of Boston by neighborhood. And here we look specifically at the percentage point change in the share of residents that are Black for neighborhoods in Boston. The pink is a decline, and the darker brown is an increase. And so you'll notice that there's been a decline in the center of the city, the greatest decline in parts of Roxbury and in the South End, and that there's been a marginal increase on the margins of the city, right? And I'd remind us of the map I showed at the beginning, which showed a large share of Black residents south of Boston in Brockton, Randolph, and you kind of see here an increase in the south of the city as well. Now, I'd like to close with what I think is a bit more of an optimistic slide. And this slide shows the share of housing units in the city of Boston that are income restricted, which means that you need to earn below a certain income threshold to qualify for these housing units. And again, this will be broken down by neighborhood. One thing about Boston overall is that we have the highest share of housing units that are income restricted compared to other major cities. So for example, New York, right, which is great. I think about 1 in 5 housing units are income restricted. But you'll notice that that's not evenly distributed throughout our city, right? So again, in the center of the city, we have a higher share of housing units that are income restricted. And in Roxbury in particular, over 50%, 54% of housing units are income restricted. And so in many ways, this is the story of successful community organizing, right? This is the story of community leaders and activists fighting to preserve affordability in their neighborhoods and really leverage and capture economic growth to redistribute some housing opportunities to lower income residents. It is also, in some ways, a map of continued segregation in that in Back Bay, there's only 6% of units that are income restricted. And if you've visited Back Bay, there's not a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing occurring in Back Bay, right? And so with that, I will pass it off to our next panelist. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And it's still good morning, so I can still say good morning to everyone here. Really grateful to Professors Mitchell and Alexander for bringing us here to convene and discuss, and many thanks to the BC law community in general, and particularly the BC Initiative on Land, Housing, and Property Rights. It is a delight to be here for such an important, substantive, and timely conversation. So my name is Karilyn. I don't work on housing. I work on land use and highways and movement building at MIT, so really happy to actually be with you in a conversation that is so much about land loss and what it means and what it activates and what it invites. And so I just have prepared a few slides for you to talk a little bit about this broader history around clearance related to a successful highway fight here in the region, and to talk about this idea of an afterlife and activism. And so really trying to connect the dots for us around land loss and clearance and what that means not only historically, but what that means to us today in this moment of 2023. There is no such thing as history, I believe. I believe that it's just a conversation about a continuing set of intentions, resistance, and fights. And so that's what I'm here to talk with you a little bit about today. So I guess I control the slides. Let's try that. Yeah, all right. So there are a couple maps in front of you, some that may be familiar to a few of you here. What you're looking at are two superimposed maps of what would have been a large radial set of roads connecting to the interstate system, I-95. And so there was a successful fight here that culminated in 1969 with a massive protest on the steps of the Massachusetts State House, where residents from across the region came together and said, no, hell no, definitely no, not at all, no roads, the end, and they were successful. And so what you see in front of you with the dotted lines are what would have been the alignment of this road. And so I asked you to think about the break, the dash, as a stand-in for loss, as a stand-in for intentions, And so what you're looking at are three different types of invisible pressures that are at play on the screen. You're looking at what would have been in 1960, in this 1960-69 moment, a moment to reorganize the region according to macroeconomic pressures that were moving Boston and the greater Boston region from a manufacturing-based economy to something very similar to what we see today, which is a services, education, healthcare-based economy. And so the pressure to reorganize physically the landscape to be in line with a new economic regime is a pressure that you see. You're also seeing the invisible federal pressure of the insertion of an interstate highway system, which would have been the interstate highway system representing 46,000 miles of road and about $400 billion of value. So you're also seeing that federal pressure trying to insert itself into the region through this map. The third thing, invisible pressure that you do not see, but is very much implied, is the desire of people on the ground in Boston, Cambridge, and Brookline, the desire to stay in the city, the desire to manifest and to express a vision not based on automobility, a vision based on connectivity, a vision based on intersection points of access and opportunity in the land. And so you're actually also looking at a pressure of people on the ground saying, no, hell no, definitely not on our watch. And so again, want to lift up for us the way that maps hold intentions, the way they hold dreams, the way they manifest pressures, and give us an opportunity to rethink spatially what these kind of historical moments mean. So again, the road which you would have seen was called the Southwest Corridor Road, and it links north to south, and so that dotted line alignment connects up north through Peabody, and then south, what would have been out to Providence, connected in the middle of the city through that central loop called an inner belt, which you can see working its way through Jamaica Plain, Roxbury, the South End. And so an enormous example of infrastructure. We know the federal interstate highway system representing the largest public infrastructure project in the history of the United States. And so to say no to that kind of a pressure, to say no to that kind of vision about modernism, modernity, automobility was a significant fight that was successfully won and waged right here. And so what's also significant for us is to, again, think about the way that the expansion of the federal highway system is essentially bringing a fossil fuel-based economy right to the center of our lives, and the idea that the petroleum lobby, the idea that the car manufacturing lobby was pushing us toward this kind of separation point and absolutely rejecting a future that could have been based on public transit. And so what you're seeing is the expression of a very particular kind of, again, fossil fuel-based futurity, and the pressure points that were raised by every single city and town that received this kind of expansion and then said no. So what you don't see on this map, but what you should, would be a number of hot points, frontline points where people were resisting these kinds of roads. Boston was one. When you think about I-95 moving up and down the eastern seaboard from Maine to Florida, I-95 moves in one continuous asphalt stretch, except for two breaks. There's one break to our north in Portland and Maine, where people are still trying to figure out the alignment, and the other break is right here in Boston, where people said no, hell no, definitely not, I don't think so. And so the break there is significant because it refuses this kind of physical reorganization according to automobility, but also according to race. What's significant for us here is the 1956 Federal Highway Act, which unleashes this road building activity across the country as a legislative move, comes right on the heels of the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education decision, which is also moving the country in a very different, if not opposite, direction of racial integration. And so at the exact same moment, you have the Supreme Court moving in one direction, you have the legislative action moving us in a different direction, which is creating a very particular kind of torque, a particular kind of pressure in terms of the future physical, racial, and legal organization of the country is in a torque point at this moment, which makes all of these resistance efforts to stand up and to say no very significant, but it's also significant to think about all the activisms that were unleashed because of highway expansion across the United States, because of the civil rights movement, because of the anti-war movement, the student movement, and the ways that all of these movements are cross-fertilizing to express a very different kind of notion of future and what's necessary. And so for some of the work that I've done thinking about this fight, I also try to raise up the notion of not only fights for land, fights for territory, ways to think about land as reimagined, but also the way that these kinds of fights about territory seed other kinds of battles, seed other kinds of genealogies. And so what I'm offering here is a notion of a fight genealogy. Many of these fights are still in our midst. It's important to note that, again, even though I am not a housing scholar, that I'm very much aware of the fact that a lot of these fights around clearance, urban renewal, and change were right in the midst of larger housing struggles in cities like Boston in the 1960s. We were also in the midst of a housing crisis in this moment of 1960, and people were arguing for not only better housing, better transportation, better connectivity, but saying they had a right to those things. And they demanded a kind of future that centered that. And so when I share with you this kind of sketching of the knock-on effects of a movement like the anti-highway movement, it is really important for us to think about how they are connected to specific fights and claims on around housing, around jobs and education. And it's just a sketch here of some of the organizations that continue to pull this work forward. Many organizations that are activist organizations in and around the city of Boston and other cities trace their lineages back to these larger claims around territory, to these larger fights against highways and urban renewal, and so that work continues. And so from either the work of Madison Park, CDC, that certainly talks about its involvement and its earlier history related to this highway clearance fight, to an organization like the Boston Metco Project, which is about creating very powerful educational opportunities for young people who were denied that in the city of Boston, and then thinking about a voluntary opportunity to go and sit in seats in suburban communities. And so the notion that the fights continue, the notions that there has to be a way to trace policy and trace laws back to particular claims for us is significant. And then my last slide is just basically the victory lap, and I'll sit down, which shows essentially how the idea of the schematic, which is in front of you, showing what the highway would have been, an 8 to 10 lane road right in the middle of our city. That's showing you facing right into Prudential and downtown, right by Roxbury Crossing. What's amazing when highway transportation planners give you an image of roads, they never have traffic. Never traffic jams, always so pleasant, but the community refused that. We inherit the Southwest Corridor Park, which many of you may have been on, a 4.7-mile linear park of bike lanes, tot lots, gardens, which would have been the site of a highway. We also get this park, this orange line, and a new future that people demanded and made possible for all of us. So I'll sit down, but really want to thank you for just the chance to not only think about loss and not only think about documenting damage, as Eve talks to us about, but what it means to manifest different kinds of futures that are liberatory, that are possible, and that are within reach.
Thanks. Hi, I'm David Price here with the Initiative for Land, Housing, and Property Rights at Boston College Law School. And so I'm going to talk a bit about the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. And you may recognize the image of this particular redlined area from one of Professor Alexander's earlier maps. This is Roxbury in the 1930s. And I've kind of made some markers geographically for folks who are from Boston so you can orient yourself as to where it is. Kind of the northern border of this red line district is Massachusetts Avenue. The south end above it was also red line, but that's not shown here. There's kind of the narrow extension is at the bottom south, actually goes into Jamaica Plain along Washington Street. And here today to talk about the Dudley Street neighborhood, which is in that kind of eastern edge of Roxbury, running into Dorchester at Columbia Road and Upham's Corner. I was fortunate enough to live in Upham's Corner at the end of Dudley Street during the entire decade of the 1980s, when a lot of the events I'm going to talk about happened. I was not an active participant. I was a sometime participant in some of that. Later, when I was a young associate at Goulston and Stores in Boston, I emphasized helped negotiate a deal for some of the first housing built on the DS&I land trust with a bank, the Bank of New England, who was extremely uncomfortable with the idea that their security was not land owned in fee simple that they could take on foreclosure and own outright, and ultimately agreed to the deal that protected the land trust arrangement there. So we'll talk more about that. So Dudley Street, let me talk about a little bit of the history leading up to what happened in the 70s and 80s. It's a neighborhood that experienced redlining, as you can see here, disinvestment, neglect, but not urban renewal, because the community stopped that at that along what's now the Melnia-Cass border, Madison Park, Nubian Square. So the Dudley Street area was on the city's list, but never got to urban renewal there. The population developed in the Dudley Street area. It's similar to the rest of Roxbury, but it had its own unique characteristics. From the 1870s to the 1940s, there were waves of immigration by Irish, Italian, and Jewish populations. The black population began to grow in the 1950s, followed by Latinos in the 60s, primarily from Puerto Rico, and Puerto Ricans displaced from the South End by urban renewal. In the 70s, the Cape Verdean community began to grow in large numbers. And redlining meant, as you know, that if you lived in this area, you could not buy a home. You could not get a loan to buy a home, with rare exceptions. And that condition was exacerbated by something called BBURG, the Boston Bank Urban Renewal Group. The city and 22 banks carved out an area, a little apartheid area, where black households could buy homes and get loans. And that was in the part of Roxbury called the Washington Park Urban Renewal Area, down Blue Hole Avenue into Mattapan. So if you were a family in the Dudley Street area and you wanted to buy a home, you couldn't there, but you could go over a little bit into the heart of Roxbury, into that area, and you could buy a home. So that kind of further depleted Roxbury of home buying power, so to speak. And what really devastated the Dudley Street area was something a little unique to that neighborhood and two others, which was widespread arson. So as property values declined, and there were absentee landlords, folks who may have once lived in the area, those absentee landlords, they didn't do maintenance and repairs. Because you couldn't get a loan on the home to do the repairs, and they decided to just run them into the ground, collect the rents until they were meet building code, and their exit strategy was to sell to the insurance company by torching them. And afterwards, the city would take the property by tax title foreclosure and demolish the vacant shell. This was a widespread phenomenon in the 70s, in particular in the Dudley Street area and in the Fenway and in the South End. And some of those other neighborhoods, that might have been rehab arson, where there was the beginning of gentrification, and it was a quick way to do a gut rehab of a brick brownstone and get some quick money to start a rehab. But in the Dudley Street, it was more exit strategy arson, insurance arson. And after all that arson, let me give you a data point. In a 5-year period alone at the end of the 70s, the city had to demolish 735 units of housing in the Dudley Street area. And with all the vacant land that resulted, there was further neglect by dumping by contractors in the neighborhood, inadequate fire department response to fires, inadequate street cleaning. The city wouldn't even clean up the vacant lots they owned where there was dumping, and there was no prosecution of arsonists. So by the early 1980s, this is what it looked like on the left. All those, the black parcels, those are vacant lots in that what's called the Dudley area. And actually, what's on the left is a subset of what's now the Dudley DSI service area called the Dudley Triangle, which is kind of the yellow shaded inset on the right. But this is where a lot of the arson was concentrated. But the people who were left to deal with it were very different than the people who lived there in the 1950s. The white population had flipped from 95% to 5%. the black population had grown to 50% and Latinos to 30%. So those folks are looking around, talking about what can we do. A third of the 1,300 vacant lots were city-owned or another government agency-owned. Another third were tax delinquent, likely to become government-owned. And there's a concentration in this triangle. So DSNI was formed in 1985, basically as an organization of organizations in the neighborhood, with 800 members at the founding. They and their funders noted, the biggest problem was the vacant land. They created a vision for development in 1987, but that vision could not be implemented because the parcels owned by the city were too small and scattered. So they came up with the idea of eminent domain to get the city parcels quickly rather than one parcel at a time in foreclosure. And that way, and to make a long story short, they convinced Mayor Flynn to agree in 1988, and they delegated the eminent power to a community group, DSNI's subsidiary, Dudley Neighbors, Inc. And to fast forward to the present day, those yellow parcels are all developed in that triangle. All those vacant parcels are transformed into housing now. 198 owner-occupied homes, 128 apartments. You can see outside of the triangle, there's still a lot of black parcels, black shaded parcels that are vacant. So you can see the reach of DSNI was not across all of that part of Roxbury. Those are mostly city-owned, so there's still a challenge in developing these small scattered site properties going forward. And I think one of the testimonies to the success of this land trust model is that with the Great Recession, there were no foreclosures of the homes owned on land with this land trust model. And despite Roxbury being one of the highest rate of foreclosure neighborhoods in the city, and there have been only historically 4 foreclosures. The banks, when they foreclosed, had the opportunity to convert to market rate rentals on the ground lease model. They opted not to. So 100% of that housing is still income restricted to basically 80% of AMI. So they passed the ultimate stress test for home ownership and neighborhood stability with flying colors. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank Professor Mitchell, Professor Alexander for having me here today to share with you a project that I work on called Homes for Equity. And you've heard a lot this morning about land loss and housing discrimination against people of color. I'm going to share with you a real-life project that we're doing to try to start to remedy that. So this is the reparations piece of this. So Homes for Equity is a project to build home ownership for people of color who've experienced housing discrimination. And our goal fundamentally is to help to begin to close the racial wealth gap. We know that that gap is significant. We know that it's going to take a long time. And in fact, our research showed that across the United States, in 2016, a study had estimated that without direct intervention, it would take the average black family 228 years and the average Latino family 84 years to accumulate the same amount of wealth that white people had in 2016. So this is a drop in the bucket, and suffice it to say, you and I won't live to see this gap 100% closed. But we think we have to start someplace. I have many conversations with people about reparations, and I know that it's always, how big, scary. We've done many big, scary things in this country. It's time for us to get over that reason. So I'm going to talk to you about Homes for Equity, which is attempting to start this process working with the city. So Homes for Equity is really based on the Fair Housing Act. Many of us know that the way that Americans build wealth fundamentally is through home ownership, and the Fair Housing Act was created as part of the 1968 Civil Rights Bill to try to start to remedy home discrimination. We know that white folks took advantage of all of the systemic and structural policies that were in place for them to get home ownership, and black folks were not able to do that. So we have a We are working with a number of attorneys, including Henry Corman, that some of you may be familiar with, formerly of Klein Hornick, who's our primary attorney. And he's written a substantial and comprehensive legal memo that analyzed the extent to which the fair housing and civil rights laws permit race to be considered when home buyers, members of a racial group, have been subject to housing discrimination. We are leveraging a section of the Fair Housing Act that actually calls for the remedy to redress. So many people know that the Fair Housing Act was created to prevent discrimination in housing. What many people don't know is that there is actually a section of the Fair Housing Act that says that we are obligated to remedy conditions of housing discrimination. We believe that the research that we have done, we've just completed 14 months of research, and it's up on the Opportunity Communities website. We just put it up for public dissension this week. And our research and our legal memo substantiates a significant history and current status of housing discrimination. And we plan on leveraging the Fair Housing Act to repair this damage. So people ask us often, so if you're trying to build wealth, how does that balance out with affordability, right? I grew up in Roxbury. I've been in Boston most of my life. If you've been here long enough, you're very well aware of the affordability crisis in this city, right? So Homes for Equity is not about trying to make homes less affordable. Let me just be clear about that. Homes for Equity is saying there has to be a better balance struck between affordability and building wealth for people of color who've experienced significant discrimination. And the city and those perpetrators, the state, are responsible for helping to keep the affordability. So we're at the reparations and redress piece of what we want is for them to step in and to continue to make those homes affordable, to allow the homeowners that have experienced significant and researchable and certified discrimination to be able to gain some wealth and to start helping to create intergenerational wealth for their families. So we're looking at a dual approach to what we're calling this restorative home ownership project. And we are currently in negotiations with the city. We have worked with a team. Our research has been concluded. We had a very strong local community research advisory council that helped to design that plan. And I'm going to share with you some of the oral history data that we collected as part of that research. Okay. So there are two aspects of it. One is that we need to get approval from the city, whoever's subsidizing the homes, the affordable homes, in this case, the city and the state. We need to get their approval to explicitly market these homes to families of color, and in our case, Black people. We are focusing on the Roxbury area, and we're doing a pilot of homes, working with Nuestra Comunidad, who's building 12 condos in the Burton Ave in Roxbury. That's our pilot project. We are also talking with a number of private developers in the Roxbury area that are also creating home ownership opportunities and asking them to join us and to build their homes under this framework. And what we're saying is that the whole idea of proxies for targeting a certain population have very mixed results. We want to build a fair market housing plan that explicitly says we are trying to market and sell these homes to Black folks in Roxbury. That is a significant change from the current paradigm. That is a bold and innovative step that we are asking the city, and currently in negotiations with them about at this moment, about to have a legal roundtable with the city's housing office and the corporate council to assess the risk of that, because obviously the city is concerned about the risk, reasonably so, right? So what does that mean? Let me just talk about the second thing. So the one first bold thing is the affordable homes marketed explicitly to black folks. The second thing is we're also asking the city, and this is equally big, to change the deed restrictions. So for folks that don't know, homes that are subsidized by public entities have significant deed restrictions on them that limit the equity that homeowners can realize. So if I bought a house this year, 7 years down the road, I decide I want to sell that house. Right now in the city of Boston, under the current subsidy terms, I am restricted to gaining 3% per year equity appreciation in that home. The Globe published an article last year, and I believe the research data substantiates that the average equity appreciation through July of last year was over 9%. So we're asking the city to, for this specific programs and homes that are covered by this program for our pilot, to relax those restrictions. Also, capital improvements are significantly limited. You could make $100,000 in capital improvements, you can get 2% of that under the current terms. So how are people that buy affordable homes going to realize the same kind of wealth that people in the market do, or anything close to it? So those are the two significant aspects of what Homes for Equity represents. And again, we're in discussions with the various parties we have designed our eligibility criteria, we have done the research, and we're now presenting this information to the public entities, asking for them to work with us. And they are. They're at the table, which is positive. So I want to share with you, we did 9 oral history interviews as part of our research, and one of the people that I sat in the interview with Mrs. Barbara Tony was just a fantastic, the heart of the community. Oops. And I want to share with you just a couple of quotes that Mrs. Tony told us when we interviewed her. So we found people that had experienced housing discrimination in Roxbury in some way, shape, or fashion. And what Mrs. Tony told us was that before urban renewal, I know you might not be able to read this slide, if we have the reports, before urban renewal, Roxbury had everything people needed to live a good life. So there's this fallacy that communities of color, and particularly Roxbury, are fallow. I grew up in Roxbury. My sister, who's over there, still owns our family home. That community is and was very vibrant. And that's what these policies don't acknowledge. Mrs. Tony also said to us that urban renewal and the highway programs destabilize the community. You've heard that history already today. Karilyn very nicely laid that out. That's a fact. So these are people really telling you their experience of being in that community and what that did to them. Mrs. Tony was a community organizer, by the way. She is now 93 years old. Ms. Tony also said that her family experienced racism in the housing market before they even tried to buy a home, that they were trying to rent an apartment, and at that point in time, she had 5 children, and she experienced people not wanting to rent to her because of her children. And so there are a lot of vibrant stories out there in the community, and we're looking for the city and the state to help, and ultimately the federal government, and to replicate this program across Boston. So thank you. Thank you.
This has really been a fantastic panel, and I'm going to start off by asking some questions, and then I really want to open it up to the audience because I hate when the audience can't ask questions. So to connect the two panels from this morning, right, what we saw in the earlier Black Land Laws panel was that law and policy clearly played a role in dispossessing Black people of their land in the South. And then what we see here is that when people made the Great Migration to come to the North and to places like Boston, right, law and policy once again played a role in denying people the opportunity to become homeowners, to live in other areas, and disassembling the communities that people had in place, right? And so when we talk about housing law and policy today in Massachusetts and in Boston in particular, and we talk about remedies, people say, oh, well, you know, really it's zoning And zoning, if we change that, will help ameliorate these problems. And so my question is, do you think zoning is necessary but not sufficient, or is that going to be a sufficient answer to the problems? Or because of some of the history that you all laid out, do we need to think much more comprehensively about solutions to housing affordability, unaffordability? Anyone can answer that one. Anybody have thoughts?
I can say that I know Boston Indicators has been working on some research about housing policy, and we do believe that it's going to take a lot more than just zoning changes. Zoning changes are an important first step, and it's been exciting to see the state make some movement in zoning changes. So we have our recent MBTA communities law that passed at this point maybe over a year ago that is pushing communities to zone for multifamily housing around MBTA stations, and that's big. But also there are significant cash hurdles and income hurdles that families face if they want to purchase a home. And so it really is going to require working both with home buyers, and I think programs like Homes for Equity is a great example of some of these, and in addition to zoning changes that could help lead to more supply to lessen some of the housing challenges we face.
Anyone else want to add to that one? Okay.
Well, I think I would say you could get all the zoning relief needed to build more affordable housing, but you need the money to build it. That the market is not going to build housing for those rent-burdened tenant households that we saw on Annie's slide. That there's some bills in the State House now, we're going to talk about this afternoon, that could raise more money. The city of Boston has proposed some bills for some de-transfer taxes that could do that. But there really has to be a statewide and frankly a national commitment to fund affordable housing at a much higher level. And same thing for the reparations angle of it, for that wealth generation, for targeted home ownership, for redline families impacted by redline. You need money to back that up. And really, ultimately, it's the federal government where those resources are. And hopefully housing will be a conversation in future upcoming elections, that housing will rise to the top of the agenda and it'll get some attention in a good way.
Okay, and so my second question before I open it up is I want to talk about the relationship between law and resistance, which came up in many of the presentations you made. So clearly what's true, right, is that, as Karilyn explained, there was resistance to try to get to change the law and policy so that highways would not go through the Roxbury area. Also, the DSNI story that David told was very much a story of resistance, right? People in the Roxbury neighborhood organized to make the city aware and to shame the city, really, into what was happening in Roxbury so that they could get a legal change to be able to use eminent domain and have that be a power that they, as residents, could control rather than it just being a city power. And that's how they got control of the land that David explained. And that really, the story that Maria's telling is a story of resistance. So the issue, right, is that how do we think the current resistance could help to change the law? Because one of the things Maria was saying is that right now, the current interpretations of the Fair Housing Act make it challenging for her to do the kinds of work that they want to do, because people would say if you try to give houses to people just in Roxbury who are black, that's discrimination, right? But we know that these individuals suffer discrimination. So what do you think, or can someone comment on how the resistance might help to change the law?
Well, I know for Homes for Equity, what we've started pretty intentionally is a community engagement process to get out in the community and talk to them about these limitations. Over 50% of the housing in Roxbury is deed restricted. That's pretty significant. That's pretty significant. And many folks don't realize how large that number is. They understand some of these deed restrictions, but they don't understand the impact of them on individuals, on families, and on the larger community. So we're hoping to go out and get people to advocate and support for the city making these changes, for the city to understand its role, the city and the state to understand and to own their role in this, and to be willing to put some money on the table. Because as David said, at the end of the day, it's going to be about money. It's going to be about the reparations piece and the money. And we're very clear and unapologetic about that.
I think what's coming up for me in the question is this, what is this conversation between Dr. King and Augustine about laws without morals are in vain, or some of this idea. And I feel like this conversation is really asking us to interrogate the very basis of law and its relationship to property. Right? And so this bigger interrogation of even ownership, even though that's so sacrosanct, and how our founding documents have been set, many of these movements and pressures are asking us to really think about not only this question around the commodification of property, but what makes it legal. So urban renewal, highway expansion, these things were illegal. And yet the interrogation is around the ethics driving this sense of ownership and also distribution. And so this is a big reason why, and I appreciate you raising it, Maria, this conversation on reparations is so important, because it's not just about HR 40, which is important and we should have that conversation, but it's about a bigger discussion about how are we interrogating the ethics of ownership and the ethics of distribution of property. And we have a very terrible history that is actually being litigated through this conference on why there's such a disconnect. And I think we should take our instruction from the rest of the world. This is there's obviously a movement on reparations, but even a hemispheric conversation, because this week there's a conference in Latin America on reparations that's being led by the Prime Minister of Barbados, who's the keynote. And so there's a discussion, and we're very much at the back of the train on this discussion, where the rest of the world is leading in terms of this deeper interrogation of the laws that are justifying territory and making us think about reparations and state responsibility in this work in a way that we're just not having this conversation in the United States, not yet. But this conference might be the beginning. But so just really wanting to contextualize and really appreciate your comment there, because it's a bigger story. We're not getting it right.
Yeah, and then the only other point is that there is something that I've been writing about and others have been writing about, interrogating what ownership really means. And there's ways in which ownership has been characterized as being about owning something legally, and therefore you can use it for its exchange value and the wealth that it can create, as opposed to the use value. And so a lot of what the residents of Roxbury are saying is we lived here through a lot of problems, and we have used this community in a way that gives us some right to it, even though we may not have a right to it legally. And that's the discussion. Okay, well, I could stay here for hours and ask them questions, but I think I'm going to open it up to the audience to see if anybody has questions for our panelists. And I'm hoping somebody will help me run around with a mic, because I'll be slow. Let's start off right over there. Your hand is raised, sir. So let me see. I might have to walk around in order to make this right. Okay, I'm going to say I want to make sure that you know who I'm talking about. This right here, right? You, sir, and then the woman behind you. Thank you.
What I would like to ask the panel is that, am I correct in here that in some states and counties that they're talking about you can buy the house but you don't own the land? Which seems to me like if you buy the house and you don't own the land, so whoever owns the land can say, oh, by the way, we want our land back. So what happens? Anybody familiar with that?
For you. That's a DSNI.
Yeah.
DSNI question.
So that's the DSNI model. So the idea of the Delicious Neighborhood Initiative was that the community would own the land forever and protect it and ensure it and have control over what it was used for, whether it was used for a park, a tot lot, for an urban farm, for rental housing, or for home ownership, that it would never get out of the community's control and be some developer would take it and convert it to market rate condos or put some use there that the community didn't want, like an industrial use in a residential neighborhood. So it's designed to be a form of community control, and really those 800 founding members really represented a long community process that continues today to ensure that control. And the homeowners who bought, they bought knowing that they were not buying the land, they owned the house that's on the land, but they were, to have an affordable home, they were willing to make that deal. We're going to partner with the community, that they'll own the land, we'll own the house, we'll have the right to sell the home. It has to be to a buyer who's within the income range, but they knew that going in. So I think that's the answer. If someone were to come in all of a sudden and tell you didn't own the land, that would be wrong. But it was built into the whole program for home ownership there, and the homeowners who live there are extremely happy with the stability and affordability that they have, and all the amenities that have grown up around them thanks to Dudley State Neighborhood.
Yeah, and I just was going to add before I take the next question, the community land trust is a legal structure that's alternative where you separate ownership of the land from the home, and then you have an organization like DSNI who has been in the community for years as a stable organization that then owns the land, and that's why some of the homeowners have felt comfortable with it. But you raise a good question, because a lot of people say, well, I don't want some alternative that's new. I just want traditional home ownership. I want to own the land. And because of the history we're talking about, that can often be challenging. And it's also a question, if you give that power to the city rather than a community-based organization, is that really still going to be a great idea? There was a question here, and then I'll take Daria.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your speeches today. I've really been enjoying the presentations. I wanted to ask you a question about. I have mixed feelings on the improvements of deed restrictions. I kind of wanted to ask if there is a possibility in your mind of either removing deed restrictions or very much limiting the number of years and the opportunity for renewal of said deeds to be in place, and maybe what would be kind of your ideal years for how long a restrictive covenant is on an ownership property.
Yeah, I can answer that. What we have proposed is for folks that understand what the state's doing, the Commonwealth Builder, Mass Housing has something called the Commonwealth Builder Program that they just revised significantly last year. And what that does is it has a restriction term of 15 years. And that's what we are proposing for Homes for Equity, with a burn-off after a minimum of 5 years of home ownership. So in other words, whatever the restrictions are, we're proposing that the equity percentage and the capital improvement credit be increased over what they are today, but that starting at the 5th year of ownership, that they burn off even more, that you would get more on your capital improvement credit and more equity appreciation, and that at year 15 of ownership, which is consistent with what Commonwealth Builder is doing at the state level, those restrictions would go away altogether.
And after 15, would they no longer be restricted?
Yes. After 15 years, it's called a 15-year. Yeah.
Whoever they want.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Daria, can you put your hand up, Daria? I think it's being recorded, so that's why we'd like to have you on a mic if we can. And Sam is going to run in her lovely heels to get it to you. There you go.
Thank you. So my question is really about conceptualizing solutions to the racial wealth gap. I think when we talk about the racial wealth gap, we talk specifically about home ownership, and I really appreciate the earlier presentation about land lost for farmers. But is there a way to talk about that solution that's not so fixated on home ownership? I think Professor Crockett's presentation did a really good job of explaining how the highway system has really created this fetishization of automobility, and I fear that our focus on home ownership would just sort of exacerbate that or explode that a little bit, so much more. And ideally, I'd like to see a world where we can live without cars and live in walkable cities. So is there a way to conceptualize solutions around the racial wealth gap that doesn't focus on home ownership?
Well, I'll just say that we see Homes for Equity is just one of many solutions that need to be in the toolbox. There's no one answer, right? So I'm on the board of Nuestra Comunidad, which builds affordable homes. So that was the genesis for Homes for Equity. We absolutely believe that there has to be more different verticals around what can be in the reparations bucket. But it's just one of many. To build a house, you need many, many tools. So you can't start with one. The problem is so big and overwhelming and long-standing that it has to be addressed at every single level. Health, education, housing. It's not one or the other. It's both and, right? But for people that specialize in it, Homes for Equity is a partnership of Nuestra Comunidad, Massachusetts Affordable Housing Allowance, and Opportunities Community. Housing is what we do. So that's our contribution to it.
Other questions in the? I feel like I need to give this side a chance.
Can I jump in on this
Oh,
question?
sorry, yes, let Karilyn
so
speak first, and then on this side.
I'll be quick. It's a great question, and I so appreciate the opportunity to decenter housing, because as important as housing is, and I would agree that, I totally agree with Maria that it has to be a bigger strategy, and want to acknowledge the Boston Federal Reserve Bank's work. And Sarah is here from the team today from the Color of Wealth study, which was a really important study for us here to really think about what is the strategy for building wealth, right? And so if housing is a key part of it, can we have a real conversation about education? I would venture to ask every student in this room, what would it mean if your BC law education was free? Would that be different? I'm sure the aid is great, so administrators don't throw any tomatoes at me. I'm sure that's big support. But I know that Congresswoman Presley and Senator Warren have been very vocal on their work in terms of student loan debt reduction, and what that would mean significantly for the country if President Biden was able to really move ahead with the strategy to wipe out all student loan debt. That would be significant in terms of transforming the wealth position of students and their families for a long, long time, right? So you're right to say we have to think very broadly, but also structurally in terms of through policy, in terms of what are the profit-making regimes that are actually operating on all of us across our life cycles. Home housing is one piece of it, education, healthcare. These are places where the United States consistently has a black eye. And so we need to call that out because it's actually having such an effect on folks for generations. And I know as someone who just retired my own student loan debt last year, after 20 years or more of payments. It was astonishing. I guess. I mean, thank you. But wouldn't it have been amazing if that hadn't been there for me or for anyone else? So that's the other piece of the conversation.
Okay. Did you have a question? Yes. Can we get a mic to her over here? And she's wearing a lovely white hat right there.
Okay. I heard a comment from that side of the room, and it was in reference to you buy a home, but you don't own the land on which the home is built, which seems preposterous to me. But nevertheless, if you bought that home and you didn't buy the land, is there space for you or some loophole somehow, somewhere for you to buy the land that home is on?
I guess the answer would be it depends on how you structure things legally. So in a DSNI model, there is not, because DSNI wants to keep control of that land irrespective of who owns it for years and years in perpetuity. But you could have a solution where initially you don't own the land, and then, as Maria was suggesting in her model, after being there for a couple of years, maybe you would eventually be able to own the land. It depends on how you structure it legally.
So it depends on how it was structured legally at the onset, or you can restructure a possibility.
It's important to also say that a land trust model is a different kind of it's a stabilization strategy. So to put your land into collective ownership is a means of decreasing the possibility of displacement. So people do critique the land trust model because it is not a wealth generation model for individual families. It's a stabilization model where collectively wealth can be held because people are not moved out. So your question is lovely, and it's precise because you're critiquing the limit of what a land trust model can deliver if you're talking about individual ownership of land. This is a different kind of a strategy. So I think for most folks who are developing a neighborhood, they would want to look at a spectrum of strategies to stabilize a neighborhood and build wealth overall. So it's a mixed question.
Okay, we have time for about probably three more questions. Let's collect questions then. I see 6 questions. So let's collect them. Why don't we start here?
A lightning round.
Yeah.
I have a question about home ownership preservation rather than first time or home ownership. Data around the risk of loss for home ownership and sort of transferring, I think a lot of efforts to sort of increase home ownership sometimes ignore the loss of home ownership that's happening in the same communities, and so you end up flatlining, right? So just curious if there's specific efforts or data that you're looking at, particularly maybe Anne, if you have access to that sort of data.
Well, I'd say our afternoon panel is going to look at the continuum of housing, including home ownership. And part of that continuum is home ownership loss from eviction. I know there's some folks here who are interested in some of the complicated tax title issues, which can cause people to lose their homes, or inherited property, heirs property can create unstable title. So and hopefully next year's conference will really dig into those. But we'll touch on that
at 3 o'clock
at
later
3,
today.
yep.
Okay. Other questions? Joanna, and then the gentleman here. Okay, go ahead, Joanna. Raise your hand, Joanna, so that they can get you a mic, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Hi, everyone. My name is Joanna, and I'm a third year at BC. And I'm writing a paper this semester that explores the black and white racial wealth gap and different government remedies that could resolve it at various levels. And I'm wondering, throughout my research, I found that there's, especially since the Obama administration, that there's a post-racialized American narrative that places a personal responsibility upon black people to resolve this issue. And this narrative has been pretty popular. So I'm wondering, despite having this evidence, which clearly denotes otherwise, how do you combat this sort of narrative in producing policies to help people?
Okay, so I'm going to take, actually, I can only take 2 more questions, and then we'll just have a wrap up from people. So there's a person who had their hand up right there.
My question is just with regard to leveraging the Fair Housing Act toward more race-conscious action. How do you see your conversations either currently being impacted or being impacted in the future by the impending Supreme Court decision toward affirmative action policy in higher education admissions and just that judicial federal precedent?
Okay, let's take one more question over here, and then we'll have them respond. And you can follow up in the break, perhaps, with the panelists. Let's take the woman over there with her hand up in the very end. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Hi, this is great. I'm really enjoying this conference. My name is Kathy Brown, and I work with the Boston Tenant Coalition, and we're a coalition of groups working on advocacy. Yes, hello, everybody down there that I know. But what I wanted to raise, which hasn't been raised today, and it is such an amazingly powerful tool, and that is affirmatively furthering fair housing. And 2 things. Right now, HUD, under Obama, the Fair Housing Act was reimagined or reinterpreted to really demand community engagement to develop cities' fair housing plans. And in Boston, we did that. And it was like a 5-year process, totally starting with community engagement. And then there's now a city, and Mayor Wu, adopted the affirmatively furthering fair housing plan that is part of city government. But there's one piece of it that y'all should be really interested in. That is it's a zoning amendment. Yes. Now Senator Lydia Edwards, but Councilor Lydia Edwards, who is a phenomenal lawyer, drafted and worked really hard with community folks for this zoning amendment that the BPDA and the city ultimately agreed to, that says all development in Boston must affirmatively further fair housing. It is an unbelievably powerful tool. It was held up by PolicyLink. It's the only one in the country. But it's only valuable if we use it and organize.
Okay, so let's have the panelists. Each of you has literally 1 minute to respond to any one of these questions.
So I'll talk briefly about leveraging the Fair Housing Act. We get that question all the time. The Supreme Court is going to be hearing a higher ed case, and I can't remember the other one that deals with affirmative action. We know about them, yeah. We've considered them. And what we've done, based on the recommendation of our attorneys, is that and I didn't get to share the legal language in my presentation, but we're very narrowly tailoring the program design. Very narrowly tailored. We very narrowly tailored the research to substantiate, and the research actually drove the program design, okay? We also expect that we will be legally challenged. We expect that. We're looking for litigators as we speak. So, pro bono, hopefully. Seriously, we have one on tap. No, those cases, the current political and cultural environment in this country definitely makes that a really good question, you know, because it seems like data doesn't really matter anymore.
Okay, and thank you so much. Anybody else have a final comment before we wrap up our panel on these issues? There were so many good questions. What I would say is that we're going to continue this conversation later today at 3 o'clock, and perhaps you can get our amazing panelists during the lunch hour. But I want to thank you all so much for coming, and we'll continue the conversation.